Well, hey, you guys. Welcome back to the salon. Now, we're back to thriller again. And if you remember on my abortive last video, because I had been doing these in 6-episode chunks, and I had also been watching them on the Roku channel. And when I was doing the last video, I discovered that they actually only had season 1, like up to episode 20. And at that point, I was like at episode 19. So the last video I did and the last post I did was just episode 19 and 20. And then after I did that, several of you guys contacted me and were like, well, every single episode, as far as I'm aware, people have uploaded them to YouTube. And I was like, duh, for some reason I didn't even think to look there. I'm not entirely sure why. So I was like, okay, good. Like, we're back in business. So regardless, they all seem to be on there, so I can get back into my, ever so often thing where I've been doing 6 episodes at a time. So today we're going to be talking about episodes 21 through episode 26. So episode 21 is called The Merriweather File. And this one was directed by John Brom, who actually did a bunch of these. He was a German filmmaker. He also did the 1944 movie, The Lodger, like about Jack the Ripper. I think I've mentioned him before because I think, like I said, he's directed some episodes before, and I think he directs some like further down the line as well. And this story was actually based on a novel by a prolific American journalist and crime writer named Lionel White, who actually had a bunch of his stories, like a bunch of his novels and stuff, like adapted into movies like in the 1950s and 1960s, though I don't think I've seen any of the ones that were adapted. So the Merriweather File was, actually this one was quite an intriguing like murder mystery. Like I said, this is kind of more on the crime end of things than the horror end of things, as a lot of these are actually, but it has like a lot of really cool like double crosses and plot twists and stuff like that in it. So at the beginning of the story, we're drawn like right into the mystery, right? As kind of like a sleeping woman named Anne Merriweather has apparently been targeted for death by some shadowy figure that breaks into her house, turns on the gas, and then seals up all the doors and windows and stuff, like they're gonna like suffocate her or gas her to death, right? Now Anne wakes up like before the gas can kill her though, and the intruder runs away. And then when Anne like goes out in the kitchen and sees that the potential murderer has stuffed like a child's rubber ball like into the hole in the broken window in the back door, like kind of, just sealing up the window or whatever, she like starts freaking the fuck out. So you're led to believe that there's some kind of significance like about this rubber ball. Now Anne has a husband named Charles, who's actually played by Ross Elliott, who incidentally started out his career in the infamous Orson Welles War of the Worlds broadcast from 1938. I thought that was like a fun little fact. So her husband is out of town. So after the intruder leaves, like Anne calls on her neighbor, who is also her friend and also the family lawyer, whose name is Howard Yates, who's played by James Gregory, who was in The Manchurian Candidate, among other things. Now, she tells Howard that someone is obviously trying to kill her, but she won't let him call the police because she doesn't want her husband like to find out about all of this home invasion and attempted murder business that's going on, apparently. Now, during this exchange, like between her and Howard, it's also established that Anne had tried to commit suicide like 3 years before, after she accidentally killed their son by like backing over him in the driveway. I mean, Howard tries to reassure her, is like, look, you didn't know he was going to be there. It was just an accident, like all that other kind of stuff. He's like, look, if people are going to be breaking into your house, maybe you should, Charles has a gun. Maybe you should like keep that kind of close by. And also maybe you should get a guard dog. So Charles comes home and he does actually get his wife a dog when she asks for one. Now, it's the couple's anniversary when he arrives home, but Anne doesn't really want to do anything special. She kind of says, oh, I don't feel all that well. And she tells Charles, she's like, look, I wouldn't be any fun if you went out with me or anything. Why don't you just go play cards with the guys? You've been wanting to do that for a while. So just, I'll be fine here alone. So he goes off and does that. Now, the next day, Charles is driving along and he gets a flat tire. Now, he tries to replace it with a spare, as he would, but he finds that he can't get the trunk of his car open because he can't find the key. Now, a cop stops to help him and then, calls a mechanic. Now, the mechanic, pops the trunk for him, but, surprise, there's a random dead guy in the trunk. So obviously this looks a little bad. The cops are like, what the fuck, bro? And Charles is like, look, I don't know who that is. It's like, I don't know, like, I didn't kill this person. I don't know how they got there. And the cops are like, yeah, a likely story. You're coming down to the station. Now, like I said, their friend and neighbor Howard is also the lawyer. So he agrees to represent Charles during the ensuing investigation, obviously, because they think that Charles, like, murdered this dude. Now, again, Charles swears up and down. It's like, look, I did not kill this dude in the trunk. I don't even have any idea who the hell this dude is. The problem, though, about this whole situation is that Charles only has an alibi up until the time that the bar he was at that night closed. After that, he gets real cagey about where he was and what he was doing, which, again, seems very suspicious. Now, after some prompting from Howard, not while they're speaking confidentially, Charles finally confesses to Howard that he had been with another woman and didn't say anything because he didn't want his wife to find out. Now, because he won't tell the cops that he'd been getting some trim on the side, he actually remains in custody because they're like, look, you're a murderer because you can't come up with any story as to where you were. Meanwhile, Howard is trying to convince Anne not to stay in the house alone, while her husband is in jail. But she insists she's going to be fine. Look, I have the dog to protect me now. But strangely, the dog doesn't bark as somebody breaks into Anne's house again that night. And they seem to be looking for something. Now, Anne wakes up and sort of startles the intruder and they kind of scuffle and everything. And then this mysterious person, whoever it is, runs off. Now, later on, the cops find Charles's gun in the garbage. And when they do ballistics testing or whatever, it turns out that this was the same gun that was used to kill the guy that was in the trunk of the car, whose name, it turns out, was Jake Carver. Now, Charles is still adamant that he doesn't know this guy and he didn't kill him. But Howard finds out where Charles's mistress, Virginia, lives. He goes to her house and discovers that not only is she totally open about, yeah, me and Charles were totally fucking, but she also clearly knows Jake Carver, the dead guy in the trunk, because there are pictures of the two of them together. So Charles finally fesses up, okay, yeah, I did know Jake. And at this point, his friend and lawyer, Howard, is having a meltdown because of Charles keeps fucking fibbing to him. It's oh, by the way, yeah, I lied about that. Oh, yeah, I lied about that too. But he's still insisting that it's look, I didn't kill that guy. And Howard's I'm kind of finding it a little bit hard to believe you. You know what I'm saying? I'm you have to understand where I'm coming from with this. Now, Charles says that Jake was his bookie and that he owed him $3,000. And this actually checks out because on the day he came home from his business trip, he actually withdrew $3,000 from his bank account, and then the same amount subsequently appeared in Jake's bank account. But now the cops are convinced that Charles and Virginia, the mistress, worked together to kill Jake because of the gambling debts. And then after all of the kind of circumstantial evidence is brought to bear at the trial, Charles ends up getting the chair for murder, even though he stands firm in his assertion that he didn't kill Jake, and he just pleads vociferously with the jury to find him innocent. They don't, though, because it looks really bad, and he ends up again getting electrocuted. So I don't necessarily want to, I mean, you'll probably know where this one's going. I don't necessarily want to spoil what the real solution of the mystery is, but suffice it to say that it's a lot more complicated than it initially seemed. The whole thing gets laid out in a scene at the end, which actually takes place 3 years after Charles is executed. Now, the only thing that I'll say about how it ended is I felt the story, and I don't know if the original story had this, but I felt it was almost trying to exonerate Charles somewhat, even though he was pretty much still guilty of some shit, but not exactly the thing that he got convicted of. You know what I mean? It's it's not he was a good person. You know what I mean? They kind of framed it. I don't know. Maybe I'm just reading into it, but they kind of framed it oh, an innocent man, and he went to the chair. And I'm yeah, but he wasn't really all that innocent, though. It's he didn't do what they convicted him of, but he did some other shit that was just as bad. So I was just like, so we're feeling sorry for Charles now? I don't think so. But yeah, like overall, I actually really enjoyed this one. I really like murder mysteries. I will admit that I had to like watch it a couple times to make sure I got all the details of the plot straight because it was a little bit convoluted. But in its defense, I wasn't like, I was kind of working on something else at the same time and I was like glancing back and forth. So maybe I wasn't like, this is kind of one that you sort of have to like pay pretty close attention to, like to kind of catch all the details of the plot and whatnot. So episode 22 is called The Fingers of Fear. And this one goes a few shades darker. Also crime, but kind of shade more into like horror a little bit because it's concerning a serial killer who targets little girls. Now, this was like based on a short story by Philip McDonald, adapted for the screen by Robert Hardy Andrews, who, like I said, wrote a bunch of these, and directed by Jules Bricken. You kind of have like the same people like turning up again and again. Now, at the beginning of the story, there's a teacher supervising her students at recess, and she stumbles across the body of a dead child in the bushes. Now, we learn via exposition that this little girl is the 5th victim of this murdering brute dubbed the Mad Dog Killer, who has been terrorizing this community. Also discovered at the scene is like this unusual piece of porcelain, which is found to have broken off the leg of this like expensive Italian like imported doll that not many people have one of. So in the newspapers the following day, there's a composite sketch of the suspect, which happens to look exactly like this dark-haired, chubby, balding dude named Orbach, who works washing dishes at this local diner. Not long after this, Orbach is actually spotted throwing a knife into a lake by a little boy who's out fishing. Now the kid like jumps in the lake and gets the knife. Oh, and also has a really good description of Orbach's car, like to give to the police, because obviously throwing a knife in the lake is like pretty suspicious, right? Not only that, but another witness comes forward subsequently and says, yeah, I saw that same car that the kid described in the park where several of the victims had disappeared. And, oh, by the way, I also got the license plate number. And this license plate number happens to match the plate on Orbach's dirty black sedan, which is, like I said, the same car that the kid saw. So as if all of this wasn't damning enough, Orbach makes himself look even more guilty by repainting his car and then taking it to a used car lot, like to trade for a new car. He also asks a friend of his to give him an alibi for the time of the murder, which, like I said, probably not the brightest thing to do. So when they bring Orbach in for questioning, both the fishing kid and the guy who got the license plate number identify Orbach like in a lineup as the creepy dude that they saw skulking around the park at around the time of these girls' disappearances. There is one pretty big like stumbling block though. The latest victim of the Mad Dog Killer was actually found to have some of what they're presuming is the murderer's blood on her, and it was a really, really rare blood type. Orbach, it turns out, does not have that blood type. But because Orbach fits pretty much everything else, like having to do with the case, and because the public are pressuring the cops to catch the murderer because the killings are suppressing the tourist trade, it's kind of like implied that this town like relies a great deal on tourism. So the authorities figure, hey, well, close enough. We're just going to pin everything on Orbach, whether he did it or not. One of the investigators, though, whose name is Lieutenant Wagner, thinks that they probably have the wrong man. And it so happens that he is indeed correct. Matter of fact, poor Orbach actually ends up helping the authorities solve the case because he remembers seeing a dude in the park that had this very rare, like, beautiful doll, like the one with the, like, where the part of the broken leg had been found, like, on the latest victim, you know? So this was another, like, pretty solid episode, kind of structured like a police procedural, which was kind of neat, and actually had way grimmer subject matter than I was expecting, like, from a show aired in 1961. Like, the actual dude who's the killer is this weird, like, doll-obsessed freak, and he is, like, creepy as fuck. It's actually really unsettling watching him interacting with his latest target, who, you know, the girl he's planning on kidnapping and killing, who's a little girl named Joan. She was actually played by Terry Burnham, who also starred in the earlier Thriller episode that I talked about, The Mark of the Hand. Like, she was the little girl in that as well. But yeah, this was a really good one. And like I said, went a lot darker than I was expecting for a show from this era. You know what I mean? Because it's like centered around pretty much like a pedophilic serial killer that looks like a respectable dude, but he has like a really, really weird like doll obsession, and it's pretty creepy. It's pretty creepy. So episode 23 is called Well of Doom, and this was another slightly more horror adjacent installment, but had something of kind of like a more Scooby-Doo type resolution to it. So this one was also directed by the aforementioned John Brom, who did the first one that I talked about, and based on a short story by John Clemens. Also stars Jaws and EGOT himself, Richard Kiel, who was in like tons of shit. Anytime you needed like some big hulking dude, like you called Richard Kiel, that's who you got. So in this one, we're following a guy named Robert Penrose, and he's going to be getting married soon to his fiancée, whose name is Laura. And he's actually on his way to his bachelor party, accompanied by his butler, friend, manservant, whatever the dude is, whose name is Jeremy. Now, on this remote road at night, while they're driving, because he's like running late and it's gotten dark and everything. So they're driving, and this giant of a man, Richard Kiel, obviously, kind of looms up out of the darkness. And then when the car stops to avoid hitting him, obviously, the big fella like reaches into the vehicle and grabs the driver. There's another guy also present in this whole situation who looks kind of ghoulish, you know what I mean? Like, he doesn't look supernatural necessarily, but he doesn't really look right either, you know? And he also seems to be kind of like telling the giant what to do, so they're like working together. So at first, Robert thinks all of this is a prank. He is heading to his bachelor party after all, and he figures that, oh, one of his friends is giving him some good-natured ribbing or whatever. But it soon becomes clear that these two weirdos are dead serious when the giant apparently kills the driver, and him and his creepy boss force Robert and Jeremy like back into the car and then climb in after them, like holding them at gunpoint. Now, the spooky dude in charge tells Robert that he's actually the devil, although he prefers to be called Moloch, and he's got a few bones to pick with Robert, apparently. Moloch and the giant, whose name we eventually learn is Styx, they pretty much kidnap Robert and Jeremy. So after that, there's like kind of a short flashback where it's established that Robert suspected that his best man Charlie might try to pull some funny business like before the bachelor party. So they're kind of like trying to lead you along that path. Like Laura is kind of like jokingly telling him, oh, you better be careful at your bachelor party or you're all going to end up in jail. You know what I mean? There's also a little bit of a backstory like explored between Robert and his, you know, manservant Jeremy, who it seems have just reconciled after like some big like bitter feud that they had some time ago. Now, we then return from the flashback to the abduction already in progress. Now, Moloch shoots a pistol in the car to prove that the gun he has is real. And then Robert is basically trying to like save his own ass by saying, hey, you can have all my money if you'll just let me and Jeremy go. Moloch isn't having it though. He tells Robert that all the money he has, like, it will never be enough, right? Because that's not really what he wants. So Moloch takes the kidnapped men to this kind of crumbling, forgotten old ruin that's apparently part of Robert's estate that he doesn't keep up anymore. And here, like, Moloch does some seemingly magical shit. Like, he's lights some torches just by snapping his fingers at them, and he seems to know some information that only Robert would know. So at this point, like, Robert and Jeremy decide, well, hey, we got to get out of here, so we're going to tackle this motherfucker. But then, like, Moloch, like, points at Jeremy, and the old man looks like he keels over dead. And at this point, Robert is pretty much forced to consider that maybe there might be some supernatural shenanigans afoot. So Moloch tells Robert that he's actually being punished for some shady shit that his father did. And he's basically asked, well, kind of like forced to sign over all his worldly goods. He's like, if you don't do that, then Moloch is going to kill him and Laura. Because, as it turns out, by the way, Moloch and Styx had already abducted her too, and are keeping her prisoner in this like dungeon situation they have down here, which also contains a very, very deep well, hence the title of the episode. So Robert has this plan that he's gonna like jump into the well and pretend to kill himself and then like climb out and save everybody later. But as it turns out, Styx, Richard Keel's character, just like picks him up like that and pitches him into the well. And he's like, well, that wasn't how I wanted that to happen, but oh well. But he does like survive the fall, and he manages to climb out like he had planned to. And he discovers after he does that Moloch and Styx are not at all what they seem. As a, like, they're not supernatural. They're just guys, and they're actually like working with Jeremy, like to fuck over Robert. They were gonna like throw him in the well, so they were like pretending to be supernatural and all this other kind of stuff. So this was actually another pretty fun one. Actually kind of benefited a lot from its foggy sort of faux English setting. It wasn't really shot in England. I think it was shot in a backlot somewhere, but it kind of did look like that. It had that feel to it. Had like some kind of gloomy stone houses and dungeons and all that kind of like very sort of gothic sort of situation. Now, I did like the initial ambiguity over whether the kidnapper was actually the devil or even whether the whole thing was a prank. Though I will say that I think the story would have been like more suspenseful if it had been told like just in chronological order instead of stopping to do that flashback kind of thing at the beginning. And I think too that they showed the wife or the fiance getting kidnapped too early. So it's like you already knew that it wasn't a prank, you know what I mean? Because I kind of feel like they were trying to make it seem like, oh, is it a prank or not? Like, but I feel like they maybe could have like left that going longer. But I mean, you know, that's kind of neither here nor there. It's not that big a deal. And honestly, too, like another thing is that I thought the sequence where Robert was trying to escape from the dungeon seemed like it went on a tad too long. But overall, this was still like a pretty decent installment. Although I will say that of the 6 that I watched, like just, you know, in doing this video, I think this was probably my least favorite. So episode 24 is called The Ordeal of Dr. Cordell. And this episode featured 3 actors that I recognized from movies that were featured on Mystery Science Theater episodes. I mean, to be fair, they were in tons of other things too, but it's like because I've seen like all the MST episodes so many times, when I see an actor that was in one of those movies, I tend to recognize them most from that because I've seen them so many times. But in this one, you had Robert Vaughn from Teenage Caveman. I think most people know him because he was in Man from U.N.C.L.E. and he was in like tons of other stuff, but I knew him from Teenage Caveman, which was like his second movie or something. You also had Kathleen Crowley from the Rebel set, and Russ Conway, who was the priest in The Screaming Skull. So there you go. So this one was actually written by Donald S. Sanford, who also wrote the teleplays for the previous episodes. We talked about Well of Doom, which is one I just talked about, The Cheaters, and The Prediction, and The Watcher. I think he wrote some subsequent ones as well. And it was directed by Laszlo Benedek, who actually got his start, I think, directing an adaptation of Death of a Salesman, like in 1951 or something like that. Probably best known for doing The Wild One with Marlon Brando. So this one's actually sort of a take on the Jekyll and Hyde story. So Robert Vaughn plays the titular Dr. Cordell. Now him and his colleague/girlfriend, whose name is Dr. Lois Walker, they've been working on these chemical experiments that I guess are like meant to help the military by testing the effects and antidotes and things like for various types of nerve gases. You know what I mean? So at the beginning of the story, though, Dr. Cordell releases an unusually volatile gas into the sealed laboratory. And even though the gas mask that he's wearing is theoretically supposed to protect him from all known gases, it actually fails, and he actually kind of ends up dying there for a couple of minutes. So after Dr. Walker and also like the head of the project, whose name is Dr. Bronner, he's actually played by Robert Ellenstein from North by Northwest, they kind of air out the lab, and they're actually able to revive Dr. Cordell, who seems totally fine, like other than he says, oh, I have a really bad headache, but he's like, other than that, I feel great. Now, his associates actually send him home for the day, just to be on the safe side, as you would. Now, when he gets there, he seems to go into like a little bit of a frenzy. Like he's kind of sent into it by the ringing of this little bell that's in his parakeet's cage. And his housekeeper's looking at him like he's gone completely fucking doolally, right? He kind of recovers after he silences the bell, but the next morning he sleeps really late and he only gets woken up by his housekeeper banging on his bedroom door saying, hey, it's almost noon and Dr. Walker has been trying to call you all morning to ask where the fuck you are and if you're ever planning on coming to work or what's the deal. So, like, he gets up and he reportedly, like, says to his, girlfriend over the phone, he's like, man, I feel great. But then the housekeeper screams and it turns out that somebody has murdered the poor little parakeet in cold blood. And I was just kind of like, no, because how I get, like, cruelty to animals. Kill all the people you want, I don't care. Like, leave the little birdie alone, goddamn it. But yeah, the birdie gets killed. So as it goes on, like, Dr. Cordell keeps telling everyone he feels fantastic, but he's starting to get a little grumpy, a little snippy with folks. And he's also becoming increasingly obsessed with finding out what exactly the mystery gas was that was able to penetrate the defenses of his gas mask. Because he figures, and probably rightly so, that it's like, if we found it accidentally, then maybe our enemies could stumble across it too, and then we'd be hosed. So Dr. Walker helps him, like, in his studies, because like I said, she's his associate, right? But she's kind of starting to worry about him because he's been, like, working in the lab for hours and hours, like, without eating or sleeping, and he's just getting, like, grouchier by the second. Now, one evening, after Dr. Walker finally leaves at 10 p.m., like, leaving Dr. Cordell to it, she's like, yeah, I gotta go sleep sometime today. Like, you can stay here, though. So after that happens, like, this pretty female student wanders into the lab by mistake, thinking it's the library building. Cordell is real douchey about it, insisting to her, it's like, you shouldn't have been able to, like, just walk in here because the door locks automatically. But she's all pretty much, hey, don't blame me, bro. It's like, it's your broken door, all right? It's like, I'm just lost. What the fuck? So after he sees that she's not, like, a Rusky spy or anything like that, he's, like, apologizes, and then he points her in the right direction. But as she's walking away down the sidewalk, there's a jingling sound, and it turns out that she's wearing these little bell earrings. So Cordell gets sent into a rage again, and apparently he goes after the girl and strangles her to death and leaves her in the bushes. I thought that it was implied by some later dialogue, it was kind of subtle, that maybe he'd raped her as well, but I'm not really sure. I mean, they couldn't really come out and say that in 1961, I don't think, but I thought that was the implication, but I could be, like, reading too much into it. I'm not entirely sure. So the next morning, he wakes up with, like, pretty much no memory of what happened, but one of the girl's little bell earrings is, like, laying on his nightstand. So essentially, whatever this gas was, causes some kind of loss of inhibition, loss of morality, or, like, triggers a psychotic rage in response to a particular stimuli. In Cordell's case, obviously, it's the sound of a bell ringing. The lead investigator on the case, like, suspects Cordell, like, pretty much immediately, because the first murdered woman was seen by Dr. Walker, actually, heading toward the lab building when it was known that Cordell was still working in there. And the detective also finds it very suspicious that Cordell had a maintenance guy out to fix the lock on the door, like, the day after that girl was killed. So the rest of the story, like, has Cordell pretty much, like, hiding out, like, at every bell sound and killing a few more women while the police are kind of, like, closing in on him. There's also kind of, like, a race against time aspect regarding whether he'll be able to figure out what the instigating gas is so that he can warn other people about its effects, like, before he ends up killing his girlfriend, like, while he's in one of these fugue states. So I actually liked this one a lot. The acting was good. The story was straightforward, but it kind of kept the tension going, like, all throughout the runtime. And I also really enjoyed the kind of the score in some places. I don't usually notice the score so much in these, but for some reason, this one just stood out to me, like, in a positive way. I think this installment actually benefited from being very simple and very focused, just, like, on one thing. There weren't, like, a lot of complicated plot twists or subplots or anything like that. So we got to just, like, concentrate just on this sort of harrowing tragedy of Dr. Cordell's, like, downward spiral and how it affected all of those around him. So this was actually, like, a really good one, I thought. So episode 25 is called Trio for Terror. And this one is like an anthology inside an anthology, because this one is actually 3 episodes in one. It's a trilogy of adaptations of stories by sort of classic horror, suspense, sci-fi writers, like pulp era writers. Now, this one was actually directed by the iconic actor, director, writer, singer, producer, Ida Lupino, who I just recently talked about in regards to one of her lamented like late period roles in the terrible 1976 movie The Food of the Gods. She was in Devil's Reign too, now that I think about it. But yeah, she had like a massive career, and it's like kind of sad that she was that people maybe just remember her for like shitty movies, because she was in like a bunch of awesome shit. But she directed this one. So this episode actually starts out with a very brief story called The Extra Passenger, and this was based on a short story by the sci-fi and fantasy writer Nelson S. Bond, who wrote for a ton of like pulp magazines back in the 1930s and 1940s. So the story is set in 1905 and centers around a guy named Simon, who's actually played by Ida Lupino's cousin, Richard Lupino, who was like an actor in his own right. I think a lot of the their family members were actors and stuff, were in theater and whatnot. So Simon, at the behest of his money-grubbing girlfriend, he's plotting to kill his wealthy and supposedly half-crazy uncle Julian so he can get his inheritance quicker. Now, Simon has this elaborate, I don't know if it's elaborate, but it's a sort of elaborate plan that involves taking a train, surreptitiously climbing out of his compartment at a stop that's near his uncle's mansion, sneaking into the mansion and murdering Julian, and then catching up with the train like farther down the line, so that by the time the train stops again, it'll look like he never got off. Like, so that'll give him an alibi, right? That was the whole plan that he came up with. So this might have actually been an okay plan, and it does seem to go well at first, like without a hitch. Simon gets off the train, like without anyone seeing him. He sort of manages to sidle into the mansion undetected, and he gets into Julian's study. When he gets in there, he actually sees a rooster tied by its foot. It's alive. It's fine. It's like tied by its foot, like on this astrological sundial type table thing. And his uncle is sitting at his desk, like not even looking up. And that's why he was able to get into the study, because he doesn't have peripheral vision. But his uncle's like too busy magically making roses appear, like under this big glass cloche thing that he has. So Simon comes in and he clobbers his uncle with this big wooden pestle, which apparently kills the old man instantly. Now, at this point in the story, I was wondering why Simon went to all the trouble of pulling all that subterfuge with the trains, though, because the dude is not even wearing gloves. Like, I know that forensic science wasn't really up to snuff, in 1905, but the cops would have still found Simon's fingerprints all over the place, including on the body, because he totally touched the dude's neck and everything, and on the bloody murder weapon, which he just dropped back into the mortar where he got it from. Like, he didn't even take it with him or try to hide it or nothing like that. I'm like, Jesus Christ. And then, like, further compounding the idiocy, I guess, he then drives his uncle's car to a spot, like, up the road, like, close to where he needs to pick up the train again, and he doesn't even bother to, like, hide it or anything. He just, like, kind of leaves it on the side of the road. I mean, I'm not a murderer myself, but I've seen enough true crime shit to know that's like a rookie mistake right there. So Simon is able to get back on the train, and then when the conductor comes around again, Simon's just like cool as a cucumber, right? He's like, oh, I must have just dozed off in my compartment. So far, so good. I mean, seems like. But then, quite suddenly, another dude is suddenly in the compartment with him, even though there was very clearly nobody in there a few seconds ago, and the conductor didn't see anybody either. So, long story short, Simon's uncle Julian was a warlock, and he sent a lich, essentially his own reanimated corpse, to get revenge by turning into a giant rooster. And no, I'm not kidding. The rooster in his study, remember that? That was his familiar, and that's apparently he turns into a giant chicken. I don't know. It's like, whatever. And he tears Simon's throat out. So the cops come in and investigate the scene and are clearly baffled by the fact that Simon was killed in an empty compartment by what one of the cops says. It's like, oh, well, I know what killed him. A fighting cock. Oh, the indignity. I know it's a chicken. So then, next up, there was an adaptation of a story that I was actually pretty familiar with. It's called The Terribly Strange Bed by Wilkie Collins. And in this one, a man named Collins, played by another familiar face to MST3K fans, Robin Hughes, who was the guy in The Thing That Couldn't Die. He actually played the thing that couldn't die, like the headless guy. That was him. So this guy's at a bar with his friend, and they're looking for some new kicks, like some new fun shit to do, when this kind of lady of the evening kind of like slides up to him and recommends this nearby, I think it's on an island, but it's like an inn and a casino that's totally on the up and up, you guys. Never mind all those pesky old rumors about bodies turning up in the surrounding waters. No, that doesn't happen anymore. It's fine. So the friend is like, well, I got some other shit to do. I have some woman named Martha I gotta go eat dinner with or something. But Collins is like totally game. Oh yeah, that sounds like my kind of place. And he heads on down there. So once he gets to the casino, he parks himself at the roulette table and starts drinking. But to his delight, he also starts winning, like, a lot. And you know that something sketchy is going on because a bunch of the other patrons and employees and stuff, like, keep giving each other these meaningful glances, like, yeah, you know what I mean? It's like that. But Collins is, like, way too schnockered to, like, notice. Now, he ends up winning a fortune. I don't know how much it is exactly, but it's a shit ton, like, from the implication. And two of the guys who run the place, like, are like, wow, you won so much money. And they're, like, helping him, like, bag his winnings, right? Now, they even offer him a room at the inn for the night because he's too hammered to be, like, running around loose. So Collins is just like, yeah, sounds like a good idea, blah, blah, blah. So, you know what I mean? So they take him upstairs. In the middle of the night, though, Collins happens to startle awake and see that the canopy of the bed that he's sleeping in is slowly lowering itself onto him via this very large screw in the ceiling. This whole setup obviously was engineered to suffocate the sleeper, clearly. Collins rolls out from underneath it just in time, then basically grabs his bag of money and escapes out through the window. So that sobered him up real quick. So he goes to his friend's house to tell him what happened. And he's like, yeah, I almost got killed, but at least he's mollified by the fact that due to his vast winnings, it's like, oh, I won all this money and I'll never have to work again. But sad trombone. Those murderous scam artists at that casino thought of that too, because the bag doesn't have anything in it but a cannonball to make it heavy and just like a bunch of scrap paper. Now, as I said, I'm actually fairly familiar with this story because I think I read it like over on my other channel like a long time ago. So in the original story, the narrator, whose name is actually Faulkner, I guess they just called him Collins because Wilkie Collins was the guy that wrote it. In the original story, the narrator actually brings the authorities to the place and all the culprits get arrested eventually. But the thriller story just ends like with the reveal of the fake money in the bag. So it doesn't have like any comeuppance for the people that tried to kill him. So the third story is called The Mask of Medusa, and it was based on a story by the legendary August Derleth, who not only, if you don't know, like founded the publishing company Arkham House, which was what made H.P. Lovecraft famous. You know, he published a lot of his stuff after he died. But August Derleth also wrote extensively in the Cthulhu mythos himself and had like produced like many works of cosmic horror that have since become classics. This story is kind of more like a prosaic story, however. It kind of deals with this unapprehended serial killer who is known only as the Leighton Strangler. Now, the cops don't know what this dude looks like. All they know about him is that he wears like black kid gloves like the villain in a Giallo movie. We as the audience know who he is though. He's this kind of shifty looking motherfucker named Shanner. So one night, while Shanner is trying to evade the cops after his latest crime, he slips into this storefront wax museum attraction kind of thing, which is owned by a guy named Mr. Milo. Now, Shanner, like when he walks in there, he's freaked out at first because he only sees like the figures in silhouette and he thinks like it's a bunch of real people like staring at him. But then like he kind of calms down a little bit like after the rather friendly like Mr. Milo kind of pops out and explains what the deal is. It's like, yeah, it's like a wax museum type attraction. Now, Mr. Milo doesn't know that this dude is the murderer either, because why would you? And actually, since Shanner seems really interested in the figures, like Milo starts to show him around. So Shanner is commenting, it's like, wow, all these figures are like really lifelike, and he notices that they aren't actually made of wax, but made of something kind of more cold and solid. He also notices that the whole museum, which only has a dozen figures in it, has kind of like a Chamber of Horrors theme, but all the figures are murderers, but they're murderers who were only suspected of their crimes and or were never caught. So once Mr. Milo mentions that he used to be a Greek scholar, you can sort of like intuit like where this story is going. And, and obviously the title gives it away too. So he eventually reveals that Medusa, the Gorgon, was a real historical figure or monster or whatever, and that her head was actually capable of turning people into stone if you looked at it. Matter of fact, Milo says, he happens to have her head on the premises, and that's how he turned all these suspected killers into exhibits. Like, he lured them all into the store because he knew that they were the killers, even if the cops couldn't prove it, and he got them to look at Medusa's face, and they turned into stone. Now, of course, Shanner doesn't believe this, but, obviously you can imagine what happens when Milo eventually finds out that Shanner is the latent strangler, like when he's digging through his pockets for money and, like, one of the black gloves falls out, and he's just like, oh, hey, let's look at this Medusa face, man. You know what I mean? So this episode was actually a lot of fun. I actually really liked that it was 3 completely different stories, but they were all kind of thematically linked by their sort of pulp magazine origins, I guess. And all of their opening acts were kind of set around the same pub because they were all set in the same year. The fact that the stories were so short meant that like none of them could really wear out their welcome, which was nice. Now I will say like all the stories, particularly the Mask of Medusa, were pretty predictable. Like once everything was set up, you knew where it was going to go, but it was still like a pretty entertaining trilogy had some really good like kind of creepy imagery in it and some like really solid acting performances. So this was another like pretty decent episode. So episode 26, Papa Benjamin, Thriller goes voodoo with this one. This was actually based on a short story by the seminal crime writer Cornell Woolrich and was directed by Ted Post, who also directed such classic films as Hang 'em High, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, Magnum Force, among other things. For MST 3K spotters out there, it also stars John Ireland, who was in a lot of things, but who I recognize from the Roger Corman film Gunslinger, which was on Mystery Science Theater. So he plays an American band leader named Eddie Wilson, who has been spending some time in the islands of the Caribbean. I don't think they specify which island it is. He's kind of like trying to, I guess, revitalize his flagging musical mojo. So at the beginning of the story, Eddie staggers into the local police station, hands the cops a pistol and says, hey, I just killed a man. So after the officers ask him the very reasonable question of what exactly the hell it is that he's talking about, he says that he shot a dude named Papa Benjamin who was killing him. The cops are like, so it was self-defense? Not exactly. Eddie then, like probably unwisely, tells the cops that Papa Benjamin was actually killing him with voodoo. So we then go into a flashback with Eddie talking about arriving in the Caribbean like the year before to play some shows with his band, which actually also features his wife, who is a singer named Judy. Now, Eddie is actually quite successful financially, but artistically, he's kind of having a hard time. Like everything that he writes now, like his new stuff, he just doesn't think it's any good, and he thinks he's in a rut, and he was like looking for some inspiration. But one evening before a show, he catches his drummer, his name is Tommy Stats, playing these really, really awesome kind of like strange rhythms like on the stage. And Eddie is like really excited by the sound of this. And he's just like, hey, Stats, what was that you were playing? But when Stats like snaps out of it, he can't remember what it was that he was playing. And he just kind of seems like real spacey in general, like overall. And Eddie and Judy are like, well, he has been acting really weird, but his wife died not too long ago, so maybe it's just that. Soon after that, though, Eddie finds a severed chicken foot near the stage during a rehearsal. And he kind of like hears these rhythms that he's, really inspired by. And he ends up following it to this like mansion, like plantation type thing. And there's like a voodoo ritual going on in there. Now he goes in and the drummer Stats is there. Like he's obviously like, in on it. So Papa Benjamin thinks that Eddie is a cop and he threatens to kill him, but Stats actually like vouches for him. He's like, no, this is my friend, and he wants to join up. So Eddie's like, yeah, totally. I totally want to join you guys' group. So Papa Benjamin does a ritual that like initiates him into the sect, I guess. But afterward, like, Eddie and Stats are leaving, and Eddie tells Stats that he's like, I don't really believe any of this voodoo bullshit. I'm just, wanted some of those sweet, sweet voodoo rhythms so I can appropriate them for my own work. And Stats, who is actually like a true believer, is really, really offended. And he basically tells Eddie, well, you just signed your death warrant. And so he just like stalks off, never to be seen again. Like, he basically was like, bye, dead man, you know what I mean? So there's that. So sometime later, Eddie has composed a piece called Voodoo Rhapsody, and his agent comes down from New York, like with some Broadway people, to like see the show. Now, it seems to be making a big splash. People seem to be into it. But then Eddie passes out in the middle of the performance. And then the next morning in his apartment, he finds like a little voodoo doll like underneath his pillow. So Eddie ends up going back to New York, but his health really starts to suffer. Like, he doesn't show up for most of his engagements. He passes out at shows where he does actually show up. He stops performing the voodoo song, but his deterioration just continues anyway. And his agent is warning him that it's like, hey, like, theater owners are canceling some of your shows because they've heard about all of your problems that you're having. And if things keep going the way they are, then you're eventually going to go broke. His wife, Judy, is also starting to have some second thoughts about their relationship. Eddie finally actually does admit to her and tell her about the voodoo curse, and he's like, yeah, I think it's real, because he didn't believe it at first. But after all this time, he's like, yeah, I think it is. And she's like, she seems kind of like sympathetic, but she's like, I don't, voodoo's not real. I think you're just having a mental breakdown and you really need to like get some help for that. So she gives him an ultimatum. She's like, look, go to a real psychiatrist or I'm walking out on you. So he basically says, well, I don't think a shrink can help me. And she's like, okay, bye. So she like takes off. So Eddie decides pretty much the only course of action is to go back to the Caribbean and get Papa Benjamin to lift the curse. But when he gets down there and asks Papa Benjamin about it, Papa ain't having it. He basically tells Eddie, he's like, look, you took a solemn oath to join the sect, even though you didn't believe in it and you had nefarious motives. And Papa don't play that. So Eddie basically like empties his pistol into the stubborn old coot and then just beats feet out of there. So we then come back to the present with Eddie in the police station telling them this whole tale of woe. So the cops are basically like, okay, well, take us back to where Papa Benjamin's body is. But of course, when they get there, it's gone and the room is empty of all the voodoo stuff that was in there just like a couple of hours before, like when Eddie killed him. It looks, matter of fact, as though nobody has lived here for quite some time, which actually ties in with the detective's earlier assertion that it's like, look, the practice of voodoo has been illegal on this island for 50 years, and, we don't think anyone's really practicing it anymore. So Eddie gets slapped in a hospital. His agent flies down to see him. Obviously, everybody just thinks he's completely delusional. Now, he, eventually recovers, and then he goes back to New York, and he reconciles with his wife, and it seems like his career is getting back on track, too. Because at this point, like, a significant amount of time has passed, and, like, his agent and his wife and his band members have been, like, working behind the scenes, like, to kind of get his reputation back on track. Turns out, matter of fact, that his agent has even booked a gig for him and his band back at that same club in the Caribbean where he found that chicken foot before. Now, everything's fine, like, while he does the show, until a bunch of people in the audience start yelling for him to play Voodoo Rhapsody, which made me laugh because it was very much like Freebird, but it was like Voodoo Rhapsody. It's like, it was making me laugh. Eddie is pretty hesitant about this, but he's like, okay, well, I'm fine now. I've recovered. It wasn't really voodoo. So they start playing it. Now, the band actually plays the entire piece, like, straight through, seemingly no problem at all. And Eddie looks like relieved, like at that. He's like, oh, we did it. We got through the whole thing. It's totally fine. However, it will surprise no one to know that ultimately the voodoo curse wins the day because Eddie drops dead at the piano, like, while the audience are still, like, applauding the end of the piece. So then the camera kind of pans over and we see, like, the voodoo doll beneath the piano. So it came back and got him in the end. So this was another pretty solid episode. I guess because it was 1961, and as soon as they said it was about voodoo, I was kind of expecting it to be kind of racist. But it actually wasn't too bad. It was actually, like, relatively respectful, at least for the time. Yes, it did posit the existence of real voodoo curses that killed people, but I will say in its defense that it did portray the believers in the voodoo as just like the followers of any other religion, like just as committed to their faith. Like it didn't really portray them as like weirdos or other or anything like that. Not really. I mean, not that I perceived. And to be honest, it actually kind of depicted Eddie as like a dick, like, because it's like he wanted to steal their music and steal their rhythms, and he was willing to lie to Papa Benjamin in order to gain access to it, and then like he made all of this money off of the rhythms that he stole from them, so it made him out to be kind of like a jerk. Like, I guess he's kind of sympathetic, but they didn't portray him like overtly sympathetically. So even though there weren't really any twists in this one either, like you could pretty much know where it was going, it was still like pretty entertaining despite all of that. I haven't read the short story it was based on, but from what I heard, like just from looking at a synopsis of it, this adaptation did take a couple of liberties, like with the source material. Like it added in the wife character, I believe. It left this in the Thriller episode, it left the fate of Stats like ambiguous, like he just like walked off and you didn't see him again. He, in the original story, he died. And it kind of removed most of the story's underlying metaphor about, because in the story, like voodoo was like a stand-in for like heroin addiction or like drug addiction, you know what I mean? Like, you know, which I guess you can kind of like read between the lines that of, because I was thinking that while I was watching the episode, but it's not real overt, and apparently like it's more overt in the story a little bit. But all in all, like I said, a pretty effective episode. So that will do it for this video. Please stay tuned for the next 6 episodes whenever I get around to doing them, because these actually kind of do take a while. It's like 6 hours worth of watching and then, you know, writing about them and shit like that too. So it takes a while to do these. That's why I only end up doing them about once a month. But I'm going to continue doing them because all of them are on YouTube. So, you know, please remember to like and share if you enjoy this content. And also please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, please check out the associated website, scaresalon.com, where there's a bunch more written content, movie reviews, book reviews, anything horror adjacent. I write a lot of stuff on there every day. So go check that out, please. And I will see you guys again on the next one. Bye.